Today we're having a look at one of the craziest games I've seen all year. It's been sending shockwaves through the entire chess world. Even if you haven't seen it, you've probably been affected by it in ways that you can't even imagine. Some have gone so far as to call it the game of the century. That might be a bit hyperbolous, even for me, but then again, maybe not. Because how often do you get to see the world's #2 player, Hikaru Nakamura, fall prey to a well-known opening sacrifice that even beginners know not to allow? I don't remember ever seeing such a thing, so go ahead and get your mind right, send the kids out of the room, because this one's gonna get ugly. It's from the latest edition of 3-0 Thursday on chess.com. On the white end, we have none other than the world's #1 wood pusher, Magnus Carlsen, and he opens with d4. Hikaru responds knight to f6, holding up e4, so Magnus plays the next best thing, c4. We have e6, freeing the dark-haired bishop, which after knight to c3 does make its way to b4, pinning mare to monarch, initiating what's known as the Nimzo-Indian defense, one of the strongest and most popular ways to defend a queen's pawn opening. Magnus now strays from the main line just a bit with the move f3. This is known as the Kamak variation. Queen to c2, e3, and knight to f3 are all more common here, but this move has been growing in popularity as it does have a reputation for being quite dangerous. White is of course going all out for the big center, full-on caveman style, preparing e4 next. Hikaru knows just what to do though. He plays c5, striking at that center before it gets too oppressive. It's what you gotta do. Now d5 is the response most preferred by man and machine alike, but Magnus now strays even further off the beaten path with his move a3, questioning the bishop. Hikaru takes on c3, and after the pawn recaptures, he follows up with queen to a5, a questionable move. Since while this does attack the pawn on c3, after bishop to d2, what has black really accomplished? Well, you could make the argument that white's queen is no longer defending the center, but this doesn't even matter, since as long as black's queen is sitting on a5, if c takes d4 is ever played, then the recapture will come with a discovered attack on Her Majesty by the bishop, meaning that knight to c6 will not threaten to win a pawn if and when it is played. And after d6, e4, and a castling by Hikaru, Magnus is now all good to develop his light-squared bishop to its most active square, d3. Now, if you can imagine that queen to a5 and bishop to d2 had not been played, and that Hikaru had played knight to c6 instead of castling, then this move bishop to d3 would not be possible, seeing that it would block the queen's defense of d4, allowing black to win a pawn. But with the black queen on a5, white doesn't ever really need to worry about that, seeing that the recapture will come with that discovered attack. Now, knight to c6 is a good move for black here, maybe even best, but for some reason Hikaru doesn't play it, instead opting for the less than optimal and optically awful knight f to d7. And as much as I'd love to tell you about the surprising benefits of this backwards anti-developing move, there just doesn't seem to be any. To be honest, I'm a bit baffled that Hikaru would play something like this. The engine of course hates it. Now it does prevent e5 from being played, so that's probably part of the thinking. But why not do that with a piece-developing move like knight to c6 instead? If Magnus plays f4, supporting e5 further, then you can decide what you want to do next. Maybe play d5. There's two things you got to fight for in this life. One is the right to party, and the other is the center in chess. Of course, I'm only kidding about the partying. Don't party, kids. You got better things to do. Learn how to build a business with AI or something. Or, I don't know. What's the latest equivalent of go west, young man, or buy Bitcoin? Let me know in the comments, but don't be too convincing, or I might just suddenly stop posting chess videos. Anyway, Magnus continues f4, he wants his e5, and he is gonna get it. This move also discourages knight to c6, seeing that black could no longer respond to d5 with knight to e5, since that square is now guarded by a pawn. Best for black now seems to be e5 or f5 to prevent white's light-squared bishop from having an unobstructed view of black's kingside, which after Hikaru's move, the highly blunderous knight to b6, is what Magnus should now give his bishop, with the strongest move on the board, e5, opening that sniper's one eye to black's flimsy fortress. But instead, we have the slightly less engine-approved, although still winning, knight to f3. Hikaru puts his queen on a4, offering the trade of ladies, while hitting c4 with a second piece. Magnus says no thank you. He puts his queen on e2, defending. Now we have knight to c6, to which d5 is no longer the best reply, seeing that knight to a5 would attack c4 with piece number 3. So Magnus plays his e5 instead. It is the strongest move on the board, and the only one that gives white an advantage worth nearly 4 pawns, according to the engine, which is now recommending that black play g6, just allowing the undefended pawn on d6 to be taken. And you probably already know why, but if you don't, you're about to find out. Hikaru's move is knight to a5, piling up on c4, though giving Magnus a powerful tactic which he does now execute. Pause the video if you'd like to try to spot it, or just try to remember what you saw in the thumbnail and or title of this video. It's a well-known gift that keeps on giving, or that gives and then takes back more than it gave, however you want to look at it. I am of course talking about one of the most famous sacrifices in chess, bishop takes h7 check, the old Greek gift as it's called. Now, did the great Hikaru Nakamura somehow forget about this famous tactic? Well, maybe not, since after king takes h7, the thematic follow-up knight to g5 check and king to g8, the move that would normally be quite crushing in this position, queen to h5 threatening mate on h7, could be met with queen to c2 defending, followed by queen to g6, and white is busted. But Magnus has an alternative way to threaten mate on h7, and that is with queen to d3. Of course, Hikaru is able to play rook to d8, giving his king a square, seeing that there's no queen takes f7 check, as would be the case if queen to h5 had been playable. Magnus does come into h7 with check, the king goes to f8, and what do you think Magnus does next? I know what I would do. I'd play queen to h8 check, driving the king to e7, then capture the pawn on g7. And that is winning, but it's not the top engine move, which is why Magnus doesn't play it. He instead just castles. He wants another piece involved in the attack, and I think you can probably guess which one it's going to be. Hikaru's now in a bit of an awkward situation. If he tries to just develop normally with bishop to d7, well then there's e takes d6, guarding e7, and so threatening checkmate in one move with queen to h8. So black does need to keep guarding that d6 square with his rook. Of course, taking on e5 would just allow white to activate his rook on f1 with the recapture, converging on f7, and that's not going to be any fairy tale ending. So what's tried is knight b takes c4, hitting the bishop on d2 while adding another defender to d6. Magnus now executes his check from h8, the king goes to e7, he grabs the pawn on g7, now threatening queen takes f7 checkmate. Hikaru of course takes notice, he puts his queen on e8 defending. Kind of looks like white needs to do something about his attacked bishop now, but Magnus just ignores it and plays f5, seeing that if Hikaru were foolhardy enough to capture on d2, then we'd have f6 check, king to d7, knight takes f7, setting up a dirty discovery. If you get out of the way with king to c6, then comes knight takes d8 check, queen takes d8, f7, and somebody's about to get a new queen to which somebody else has no good defense. So what's tried in the game, in response to this move f5, is queen to g8. Hikaru desperately wants to get those queens off the board, and it's probably the best practical try. But after f6 check and king to d7, Magnus just keeps the top engine moves coming with knight takes f7, just allowing the trade of queens, which Hikaru does now initiate. But after f takes g7, he still can't take the bishop on d2, seeing that after knight takes rook on d8, black will have no way to stop white's g-pawn from promoting. So instead we have rook to g8, getting in front of the passer, threatening to win it. Magnus must finally now get his attacked bishop out of danger. He puts it on h6, defending the pawn on g7. A very convenient move to have available, since otherwise black would just be winning with rook takes g7. So you can't help but wonder how many moves in advance Magnus had seen this position coming. He really is a magical man. I mean, how does he even know this position's winning for white? Or does he even know? There really isn't a knockout blow here, but after Hikaru's b6, preparing to develop his bishop, rook a to e1, c takes d4, c takes d4, and bishop to b7, I wouldn't be feeling super cozy here as white. I mean, the pawn on g7 is a thing of beauty, but black seems to have it pretty well blockaded, so how to make progress here? Well, the engine wants knight to g5, clearing the way for rook to f7 or rook to f8, or maybe even knight to h7, looking to reroute to f6, attacking the rook on g8. Magnus plays e takes d6, which is also winning, but after Hikaru's bishop to d5, he now misses the mark, big time. What he should play is knight to e5 check, when after black's best move, king takes d6, you got rook to f8, threatening to trade rooks and then get the other rook into f8, and that g7 pawn is not going to be blockaded for much longer. There's also the threat of knight to g4, followed by knight to f6 if black doesn't take on e5. So this is the way forward for white. What Magnus plays, in response to bishop to d5, is the horrendously inaccurate rook to c1, squandering pretty much his entire winning advantage. But only if Hikaru now finds the correct move, which he does not. Pause the video if you'd like to take a crack at it. What black needs to play is knight to c6. The point being that after knight to e5 check, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and knight takes e5, if white tries that rook to f8 here, then black has knight to g4, challenging the all-important defender of the g7 pawn, as well as the f8 square. So a dead even position here, according to the engine. What's played in the game, in response to Magnus's big boo-boo with his rook, is b5, once again giving Magnus a winning position if he plays knight to e5 check, which once again he fails to do, opting for g4 instead. Again, Hikaru needs to play knight to c6, that's the only move that doesn't lose, but instead we have knight to b3, attacking the rook as well as the pawn on d4. Magnus responds rook c to d1, defending the pawn, giving himself a winning position yet again. Hikaru plays a5, looking to create a passer of his own now, with b4 coming next. And what do you think white should play here? You guessed it. Or at least you should have, because it's still knight to e5 check, with the same idea as before. Let's bring the rook into f8, trade rooks, bring another rook into f8, and just like that, Bob emerges from the basement demanding to be your uncle. So, not sure if there's some detail I'm missing here that made Magnus think this plan wasn't any good. Maybe he's thinking that after knight to e5 check, knight takes knight and pawn takes knight, black will put a bishop on c4, attacking f1, so that white can't get his other rook there, but then you got rook to f7 check, driving the black king off at d7, where white can then push his d-pawn, giving him two pawns that are only one step away from promotion. So, shouldn't be too hard to imagine why black would be losing in that line. What Magnus plays as the second best move in the position, h4, does make some sense. Pawn majorities are meant to be pushed, but after Hikaru's b4, Magnus is going to have to be very careful. Hikaru's going to be getting a passed pawn of his own now. There's no stopping that, but it's just a question of how Magnus is going to let him do it. Now the engine's calling for a takes b4, when black's best response will be a4. And this leads to a forcing variation that's so complicated that we're just going to skip it, because I don't even know for sure if it's winning for white. All I'm going to tell you is that the engine likes it much better than the move Magnus plays, which is a4, due to the fact that this gives Hikaru the chance to totally equalize the position with the move that he fails to find, knight to b2, attacking the rook as well as the pawn on a4, when after the rook moves, black has his choice of either knight takes a4 or knight takes d4, either of which will equalize the position. I'd probably go for knight takes a4, given black the two connected passers. But what's played in the game is not the correct knight to b2, but rather knight b to d2. Hikaru's willing to give back the piece in order to eliminate the pawn on g7. That sounds like a bargain to Magnus, so he goes ahead and takes on d2, and after rook takes g7, the piece count has returned to equilibrium, leaving white 2 pawns up. So you might think that the win is pretty straightforward at this point, but it's not so simple. Magnus only has one move that wins, and it's one that he does not find. But if you're able to find it, and you know exactly why it wins, then you could probably just go ahead and tell everyone that you're a chess genius, because this is crazy. Okay, the pawn on g4 is under attack. White needs to do something about that. The correct move is g5, and it's the only move that wins. But Magnus puts his bishop on g5 instead. Okay, so how does this make such a big difference? Well, fasten your seatbelts, because this is about to get ridiculous. If Hikaru were to play b3 here, which he does not, then after knight to e5 check, a move that would be winning for Magnus if he had played g5 instead of bishop to g5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, and rook to c8, looking to sneak into c2 or c4 with some equalizing counterplay. Well, here, rook to c1 would be winning for white if he had played g5 and still had his bishop sitting on d2. Why is that? Well, it's because after rook takes c1 and rook takes c1, in this position, black can now take the bishop on g5, seeing that after h takes g5 and bishop to e4, white has no way to prevent black from promoting his pawn, defended by the bishop. All of the key light squares are covered. Now, if his bishop were still on d2, he could just play bishop to c3, guarding b2. But the rook's got no way to do it. So white's going to end up having to sacrifice his rook for black's new queen on b1. And with correct play, the game should end in a draw due to white's extra pawns. So quite a variation, and not something that anyone's going to see in Blitz, not even the two best players on earth. What's played in the game is not the correct move b3, but rather another egregious mistake, rook a to g8. Not sure exactly what Hikaru is thinking here. Maybe he wants to capture the pawn on d6 with his knight, when if white responds knight to e5 check, he can retreat his king to the back rank without disconnecting his rooks. But if Magnus were to find his most decisive move in this position, and possibly his only winning one, rook to c1, then that plan would no longer be working. The rook would end up going to c5, targeting the pawn on a5, looking to double up next. But once again, the best move is not found, and we instead have knight to e5 check, which at this moment is not working, due to a move that would not be working for black if white had earlier played the move g5 instead of putting his bishop on g5. And that move is king takes d6. Now here, bishop to f4 would be the winning move if the pawn were on g5, when white would be threatening a discovered check, so the king would really need to go to e7. Then you can play your rook to c1, forcing the knight on c4 to trade itself off, and there's no rook takes g4 check because the pawn is on g5. White's rook will then invade along the c-file, and black is just one move too late to create any redeeming counterplay, with something like rook to h7 targeting the pawn on h4. So there you go. It all comes down to a single tempo here. Magnus plays king to h2, which at this point is just as good as bishop to f4, since both moves maintain equality. Hikaru pushes his passer, as one does. Magnus puts a rook in front of it. Next we have knight takes e5, d takes e5 check. No king takes e5 here, as that would lose the exchange to bishop to f6 check. So Hikaru instead puts his king on c5, looking to give his passer a little royal support. Makes sense. Magnus puts his king on g3, at which point Hikaru gives him a final opportunity to win this game with king to b4. Something like rook to b7 would have been much better, because here white has a winning move, missed by Magnus, bishop to d2 check. If the king backs up, then white can push his pawn to g5. There's no longer any rook takes g4 check to worry about. He's threatening bishop takes a5 next, as well as h5, h6, etc. And black is pretty much all done. Of course, there is king takes a4 to consider, but then we have rook to a1 check, king to b5, and rook takes a5 check defended by the bishop, when black's only hope is going to be his passed pawn on b3. However, he's not going to be able to push it through, as white's just got too many defending pieces in that vicinity of the board. So I'll leave those details for you to verify if you'd like. What Magnus plays, in response to Hikaru's dubious king to b4, is the equally dubious rook f to c1, giving Hikaru the opportunity to gain a winning advantage, which he now seizes with king takes a4. When after rook to a1 check from Magnus and king to b5, there is no capturing of the pawn on a5. Magnus tries rook a to b1, but here's a nice touch for you. Rook takes bishop on g5. When after h takes g5 and rook takes g5, Magnus needs to defend his pawn on e5. He does so with his king, attacking Hikaru's rook. It drops back to g8, probably looking to get behind his queenside passers if necessary. Magnus pushes his to g5. We have a4, king to g4, probably dreaming of king to h5, king to h6, g6, etc. But this is too little too late. In fact, it's 4 moves too late according to the engine, which is saying that he'd have to get his king to h6 and his pawn to g7 without black making a single move in order to equalize the position. So Magnus is pretty much toast at this point, but he's going to give it the old college try. We have a3 from Hikaru, rook to c3, king to b4, attacking the rook. It goes to d3. a2 is next, hitting the other rook. We have a check from d4, king to c3, and now one final attempt at trickery with rook b to d1. When if Hikaru were to push his pawn to b2, Magnus would have a perpetual beginning with rook to d3 check. Hikaru is not about to fall for that though. He puts his bishop on c4, guarding d3. Magnus delivers the check anyway, which I'm guessing was a pre-move. Didn't really matter though, since there's no defending against b2, followed by the promotion of one of these 2 pawns on the next move. Hikaru, of course, takes on d3, and it's at this point that Magnus Carlsen resigns the game. So, what a nightmare for the greatest chess goat of all time, who had a winning position for nearly the entire game, only to let it slip away in the midst of the chaotic complications that the great Hikaru Nakamura was able to generate. Never underestimate the world's number 2 player, or I should say the world's number 1 player, because that's what Hikaru is at the moment when it comes to online blitz. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel, smashing that like button, and or leaving a comment, if and only if it feels right. Those things always help support the channel. Take care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you next time.